it will not be allowed to borrow at all. We have got to deprive, by the ballot box, governments of the right to borrow and make them live within their means, just as we are compelled to live within ours. That would do more than anything else to reduce the governing class that now lives off borrowed money as well as off taxation to a gibbering mass of jellies, because they would not be used to the idea of living within their means while they're telling us that we have to have austerity so that we can live within our means. So that's step number 2. Tell governments that if they are going to continue to borrow year by year, to hand out sweeties to those who voted for them, whether they be corporations or trade unions or special interest groups or environmental groups, the answer is no, we won't elect you. We will only elect you if you promise that you will balance the budget from year 1 and keep it balanced. That is step 2 in Monckton's modest proposals for worldwide economic recovery.
Lord Monckton, there seems to be a difference in how we're handling this global economic crisis. In Europe, they're issuing austerity measures, and here in America, we're doing what's called quantitative easing by pumping vast amounts of dollars back into the system and hoping to cushion the fall. And as recently as today, I've heard that Plan B could possibly be seizing 6,000 tons of German gold that we have stored underneath the Fed in New York City, giving the United States a whopping 14,000 tons of gold, making the United States the biggest carrier for gold, and that would enable the United States to back their new currency on the gold market. If that happens, what do you foresee happening to the United States as far as the rest of the world and Germany?
Right. Now, I have no idea what the current gold holdings of the Federal Reserve are. I simply haven't looked recently, I must confess that. So I have no idea whether the figures you've just mentioned are true. They sound very, very much on the extremely high side.
Yeah.
And certainly I would not advocate that governments should be allowed, instead of borrowing, merely to rob holders of real assets by simply confiscating assets. That is an entirely unacceptable way of carrying on, and it's something that must be sternly resisted. Any potential government that says it's going to do that must be voted out of office forever.
Amen.
There can be no question of doing any such thing. You must allow those who have been careful and prudent enough to accumulate assets to hold on to them. You can tax the profits they make, and that's all you can legitimately do as a government. So there must be none of that nonsense. If you want to back new private currencies with assets, as people bring in the Toy Town Mickey Mouse currencies that are now used to the currency boards would spend those immediately on buying real assets, and in that way the new sound currencies finance themselves automatically and fully, just as they did in Hamburg 500 years ago, for 250 years, 400 years ago. So that's how you do that. You don't need to go for grand theft bullion, I suppose we'd call it. That's not an appropriate technique at all. We've got to be very common sense about this.
No, that's true. Now, let me ask you this, Lord Monckton. Do you feel that there are enough people out there of sound moral character that can be put in these positions of power without being corrupted? And then the second question is, do you think there are enough individuals out there to vote these people in, if there are enough people to do so, that haven't been corrupted by the rampant entitlement programs of the last 50 or 60 years?
I think the days of entitlement programs are also going to have to come to an end. In future, I think we're going to have to take a more hard-nosed commercial view of this, and we're going to have to say, fair enough, if you are unemployed and you are still on the old system where you haven't insured yourself against unemployment, then okay, for 3 or 6 months, the state will help you out. After that, you are on your own. You get off your butt and you get on your bike and you go and find work, or you starve. Now, that may sound cruel, but in most countries where it's been tried, if there are countries with a reasonable developed Western economy, nobody starves,
right?
Because there is enough work for everybody. In a free economy, there always will be. It all adjusts itself out. You don't need to worry even about enormous numbers of immigrants coming in, because the immigrants coming in create their own jobs because they've got to be fed and housed and clothed just like everybody else.
Right.
So the more people you have in the country, the more jobs there are. It's all gloriously self-regulating, and if only governments would stop trying to interfere at every level and would stop handing out money to all some these entitlement programs, then we would get back to something like prosperity. What we've got to do is to accept that commercial entities running insurance schemes in a disciplined fashion are far more likely to be able to provide short-term and long-term insurance against ill health or unemployment than governments are. Government programs of this kind end up being self-defeating for a rather interesting reason, that entitlement programs will always grow because voters will always say, hey, if I can get free money from a socialist government, I'm going to vote socialist. And so every time you get a socialist government, you get a vast increase in entitlement programs. We saw this in the United Kingdom over the last 13 years. Did it make those on entitlement any better off? No, of course it didn't, because to pay for all this, money had to be taken in extra taxes from the productive sector of the economy, ultimately making the productive sector less profitable, driving jobs to less high-tax jurisdictions, and reducing very dramatically the amount of money available to the government in taxation to pay for the entitlement programs. That's what happens if you get it wrong, because you're socialist and you don't actually care about where the money comes from. And so what we have to do, and this, if you like, is step 3 in the Monckton recovery plan, is to announce the termination of all entitlement programs. Now, that you can't do overnight, because if you did, those who have become, sometimes for 3 or 4 generations, totally dependent on living off the taxpayer would suddenly find that they had to get used to the idea of going straight out to work, and many of them would simply not be able to do it. So what we have to do there is to give them a reasonable time limit for each of the various benefits that are being sprayed out by socialist governments around the world at the moment, and say that those benefits will be reduced stepwise over the next 5 or 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, if you haven't made your own arrangements for looking after yourself financially, then tough luck, bye-bye. And that way, we can then leave enough money in the private economy for people to make their own provision to look after themselves. And that has been shown time and time again to be 10 times more efficient than governments doing it instead. Now, it's a tough-minded policy, I accept. It even may sound cruel, but if you're careful and you do it right, it isn't. What is cruel is to do what the socialists do and to say, we don't care where the money comes from. We're going to borrow or print or steal gold in order to go on handing out money in entitlements to people who haven't worked for it. And yes, of course, the people who haven't worked for it will always vote for a free lunch. But in the end, the socialists who say that they're being caring by handing out everybody else's money but their own to these feckless or reckless third parties who won't work, those socialists are being cruel to the very people they're handing the money out to for 2 reasons. First of all, these free handouts destroy the souls and destroy the hope and destroy the energy of the people, sometimes for generation after generation, who end up depending utterly upon them.
Right.
And secondly, and more seriously, governments are simply running out of money. They can't afford to go on handing out these entitlements. And if you get to the point that governments are reaching now, where they can't any longer afford these entitlements, and they have to start taking drastic measures to curtail the welfare payments they've been handing out, and to do it all in one go rather than carefully spread over 5 or 10 years, as I am advocating. And that's the position that socialist governments around the world now find themselves in. Then that is really cruel to the people who live on those entitlement programs. Socialism is cruel because it sounds kind, but it's kind on other people's money. And as Margaret Thatcher used to say very pointedly and very correctly, socialism is wonderful until other people's money run out, which it always does sooner rather than later. Other people's money has now run out. That's the end of socialism, and we don't want to reinvent it. We want to go away from it. No more free welfare handouts. Those have got to be phased out, and we've got to go back to a notion of everyone taking responsibility for his or her own future and that of their families.
You're right, and personal responsibility is something that's sorely lacking in the world today. And if you take a look at history, you'll notice that people are often very charitable when they actually have the money to be charitable with. So if people fall upon hard times, I'll give you an example. The Johnstown flood of 1889, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a dam bursts and caused great strife and a lot of suffering in the town of Johnstown, almost wiped it out. And they received...
Oh, the photographs I've seen of that flood are quite extraordinary. And, of course, that reminds us that extreme weather events have happened before and have had far more catastrophic consequences than they tend to have now.
And
yes, you're quite right.
What it also shows, Lord Monckton, is that, the people that belong to the hunting and fishing club, the Great Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, that owned the dam at the time, they were elitist. People like the Mellon family, Carnegie, and a lot of people, Pittsburgh elitists, they had a stake in that. And when the dam burst, they found engineering faults and everything else. But it wasn't because they were like, ha, 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 how do I exterminate 2,000 people? It's not like that. What it was just blatant disregard of the dam itself, and having a little too much confidence in its structural integrity, coupled with the fact that they had an enormous storm come out of nowhere. And that was the truth of the matter.
That's right. But the important truth also is that in those days, people helped each other in these disasters.
They picked each other up.
Indeed, yes, they picked each other up and they helped each other out. And they found each other places to stay, and that is exactly what happened. It is far cheaper, it's far more economical for people to help each other out in a charitable way than for the state to try to nationalize charity in the way that it's done and say, no need for charity anymore. We, the state, will pay for your health and your unemployment and your welfare and your free school milk and your free education and everything else. Because in the end, as we've said, other people's money runs out sooner rather than later, and when it does, you're back to square one again.
Absolutely.
So we've got to get away from the idea of letting government provide welfare. They don't do it well, they don't do it adequately, they end up always running out of money because the people with their hands and caps out are always going to prevail in elections. And so now we have to change that, and we have to say, sorry, but if governments are going to be handing out free welfare without restraint in the way they have in recent years, then those governments will never get elected again.
That's right.
We have to start using our vote intelligently and not voting in these lunatic regimes. And I'm sorry to speak of your present government in these terms, but really, these are people
You're absolutely right.
Who do not have the best interests of the American people at heart. They believe in an alien, failed political theory. It's called communism. When I first described President Obama as a communist in the spring of last year at a press conference at the Willard Hotel, and various press people came to lunch. And I gave a short speech saying that I was worried that with a communist in the White House, this global warming nonsense would receive lavish funding which would do nothing to change the planet, but everything to wreck the Western economies, and particularly that of the United States. I was taken on one side by the doyen of the journalistic community there, and he said, look, a word to the wise, to use the word communist is really such an insult in the United States that,